my name is Judy Fleck, and I'm from Vitalia in Stowe. And I'm going to read to you today a book called The Power of Her Pen. I thought it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. So I hope you enjoy it also. Ethel Lois Payne always had an ear for stories. Her grandparents' front porch stories of Kentucky cotton fields and Tennessee auction blocks. Her parents' kitchen table story of northbound trains from sharecroppers' plots. Long past her bedtime, Ethel collected the stories of people who followed a path with dreams. In 1911, the year Ethel was born, her father William worked as a Pullman porter on railroad trains, helping passengers with their luggage and serving them in dining cars on trains that crisscrossed the country. He tossed bundles of a newspaper called the Chicago Defender onto train platforms, spreading news of jobs and hope for Blacks in the segregated South. Ethel didn't see her daddy much, but his firm hand ruled from a distance. He and her mama, Bessie, a Latin teacher, filled their home with an equal measure of discipline and love. On Saturdays, once the house was spotless, Bessie took Ethel and her 5 siblings to the white side of town, where there were libraries with shelves stacked tall with books. There, Ethel flipped through the pages and memorized passages to recite to anyone who would listen. 1 month after Ethel started high school, her father came home from a long run on the railroads and took to bed sick with a headache. The house was hushed, the doctor was called, but nothing could be done. After William passed, Bessie worked hard to make ends meet. Ethel walked a mile to school each day. The neighborhood residents screamed and yelled and threw rocks at a Black girl who dared to go to a school with whites. Sometimes I stood my ground. Sometimes I got a bloody nose from fighting, but that was the way it was, Ethel recalled later. Ethel spent her school days dreaming of life far beyond her neighborhood, except when she was in English class. There, her teacher, Miss Dixon, encouraged her writing. Her mother encouraged her at home, and Ethel wrote during the day, and she read her stories aloud to her family at night. The school wouldn't let a Black student work on the school newspaper, but after reading Ethel's writing, it did publish her first story. During the Great Depression, with money even tighter than before, Ethel attended a local college with free tuition and took writing classes. When World War II began, the United States fought overseas while Ethel fought against racism and injustice in her own backyard. She started by organizing a women's social group at her church to make improvements in her community. Then she started a story hour for children. Next, she started a scholarship fund. After battling long and hard in Chicago, Ethel set her sights on politics in Washington and began writing letters to newspapers commenting on unjust laws and discrimination against Blacks. I was beginning to have the seeds of rebellion churning up in me, Ethel later said. By the time World War II ended in 1945, Ethel was aching to see a world far up beyond the south side of Chicago. She got the chance when she answered a newspaper ad for a job overseas. With her mother's blessing, she was on her way to Tokyo, Japan. Ethel set off to explore, filling page after diary page with her observations and experiences. Some pages she devoted to the stories of the Black soldiers. Life as a club director on a U.S. military base kept her busy organizing activities for the soldiers. But she noticed that in Japan, Black American soldiers who had fought alongside white American soldiers had separate housing. They had hottest jobs on the base and almost no chance to be promoted. Ethel never imagined her voice would soon be heard in the United States, all the way from Japan. Ethel showed her diary entries to a friend, a reporter who was on assignment in Japan. With Ethel's permission, he shared her writing with his editor back in Chicago. Her sister was the first to call her with the news. One of Ethel's articles about Black soldiers stationed in Japan had made it way across the seas and into newspaper headlines, which were now in the hands of thousands. When her job in Japan ended in 1951, Ethel returned to her home, her family, and a job offer from the Chicago Defender, one of the only two daily Black newspapers in the country and the main source of news in the Black community. It celebrated the births, the graduations, marriages, retirement news of its Black citizens. Ethel once joked, "You couldn't grow up in Chicago and be Black if you didn't know the Chicago Defender." As a features reporter, Ethel wrote about housing, jobs, healthcare, and community events. After 1 year, Ethel and her notebook headed to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where politicians debated civil rights. As more and more readers opened their newspapers to read the articles written by Ethel L. Payne, the Defender's circulation grew. After 3 years, her editor asked, "Why don't you go down to Washington?" Of the 204 reporters, Ethel was one of only 3 Black journalists issued a White House press pass. It allowed her to sit in the treaty room in the White House where the president met with journalists. Only when the president nodded could a reporter ask a question. These experienced reporters knew how to jump to their feet, hoping their voices would be the ones to catch the president's ears. At first, Ethel sat waiting. Then she stood. Then she waited more. Finally, President Dwight D. Eisenhower turned to Ethel and nodded. "Mr. President," Ethel began shakily. "Mr. President." She looked down at her carefully written question and asked the president's view on a racial incident that had occurred at the White House. U.S. Negro reporter draws Ike's wrath, a headline screamed, but Ethel kept asking questions. The white press was so busy asking questions on other issues that the Blacks and their problems were completely ignored. She later recalled, she asked how the president planned to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case, which outlawed segregation. "I wish that all the people could understand that we want for our children the same rights as any other human beings," she later explained. When Eisenhower left office in 1961, Ethel asked the young president, John F. Kennedy, about his civil rights voting record. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, she asked Lyndon B. Johnson about the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Act. And then she asked Richard M. Nixon questions about the lack of Blacks in his administration, and Jimmy Carter questions on education. Ethel spent so much time in the White House, she earned the title First Lady of the Black Press. Outside the White House, Ethel interviewed protesters in Montgomery, Alabama, and Little Rock, Arkansas, and marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Somebody had to be fighting. Somebody had to speak up, Ethel later declared. Writing stories of the protesters' struggles was her way of doing just that. For nearly 5 decades, Ethel fought long and hard to bring attention to the issues that mattered most to her community and became the voice of those who had none. Ethel wrote the stories that the mainstream media refused to. It was her questions to presidents that finally made readers of all races pay attention to the plight of African Americans. Her reporting highlighted their struggle for justice, equal pay, housing, and education. And in her role of informing her readers, Ethel created awareness and activism in the fight for civil rights for people across the globe. Always with an ear for stories, Ethel asked the questions and demanded the answers for people whose pasts were paved with dreams. "I've had a box seat on history," Ethel once said, "and that is a rare thing."